video for a while. So, in this block, we will be doing introduction to communication. In block one, we'll be doing introduction to communication. And in this unit, it is divided into different units like basics of communication. And in this basics of communication, I'll be discussing the evolution of communication in human society, how communication came into being, and how the present form of communication has been developed. Okay, so that is what we will be doing in unit one. And in unit two, we will be studying the process of communication. And in this unit, we will discuss the process of communication and explains the roles of sender and receiver in the process of communication. So you all know that for the communication to take place, there should be a sender as well as a receiver. So what are the roles played by the sender and receiver will be dealt here in the process of communication. And in this unit itself, we will be discussing the different types of barriers of communication, that is, obstacles. Okay, while you communicate, what are the different obstacles that could happen between the sender and the receiver, or any sort of hindrance, okay, while the communication is taking place, and how these hindrances can be overcome. So that happens in unit two. And in unit three, we will be explaining about the types of communication. There are different types of communication like oral communication, written communication. So all these important communications are used in your daily life. So we'll be dealing with that in the types of communication. And in unit four, we'll be dealing with forms of communication at workplace. Okay, so uh, this is the ultimate thing in communication, that is, in your workplace, how the communication happens. There are different forms of communication which could happen in your workplace, like formal communication, informal communication, and their sub classifications. So we'll be dealing with all these things in this unit. So the main objectives of this unit is, after studying this unit, you'll be able to understand the role of business communication in business enterprises, that is, in your workplace. Now, you will also be able to analyze the important dimensions of business communication, and you will be able to understand how characters communicate verbally and non-verbally through case studies. There are different case studies also, which is given in your text. So you will have to go through those case studies to understand the basic aspects of communication. Okay, now let us start with our business. I said in unit one, we will be dealing with the evolution of communication. Now, talking about communication, see, communication is one of the most important skills that you should have or you should acquire. Now, so it is very important to understand the different types of communication, the process of communication, what is communication itself. So it plays an integral part in any organization. And why communication is so important? Because in order to be successful, in order for your organization to be successful, you have to interact. You have to interact with your superiors, you have to interact with your co-workers, and you have to interact with your subordinates. So you have to have direct communication, indirect communication, formal communication, informal communication. There are a lot of communications, even talking in a phone, okay, to another person is a part of communication. Sending emails, okay, writing emails, letters, business reports, proposals, these are all parts of communication. So all these things which I just mentioned, that is talking through the phone, reading and writing emails, letters, business reports, proposals. Now, everything has one thing in common, and that is the sharing of information. While you communicate, what do? You share information, you share knowledge. So that is what happens during communication. See, in order for your enterprise to be successful, it needs communication. Okay, so it is the center of all business activities. So the better our communication skills, the greater our chances of success. So everything depends on communication. So let us look at the evolution of communication. Now, you may be thinking about how communication happened in the world. See, when during the origin of the world, we have different theories about the origin of the world. Just imagine the first human beings on the earth. How did they communicate? They did not have a language. Okay, they did not have a language. Did they send letters? Of course, no. They did not have a language, so how could they send letters? So there are a lot of theories which uh, uh, give us an answer. Like sounds came first. People produced sounds, different types of sounds to communicate, and later sounds turned into language. It acquired a structure. It acquired a form. Uh, it developed into a language. So you may try to guess which could be the first language in the earth. Is it English? Is it Malayalam? Is it Hindi? Nothing. Okay. There was a language. Okay. There are a lot of theories regarding that. And nobody was able to say which came first, which language came first. Of course, it had to do a lot with sounds. Okay. There was a sound system which came first. And then we have a lot of proofs about how people communicated. One is through cave paintings. Okay. Paintings on the cave. You may have seen different caves in heritage sites or in different parts of your country where people made pictures on the caves. Okay, so the theory says that they try to communicate using pictures. So pictures were also used to communicate. Pictures were used to record events that happened during their era. So that's how we know about our ancestors. Okay, by looking at the pictures on the cave. So that is one form of communication which uh, was being researched and the research is still going on. Now, another form of communication is through symbols. People used different types of symbols other than paintings. Okay, so people use signs and symbols. Okay, rock carvings. Okay, you have heard about rock carvings. It is also called as petroglyphs. Okay, petroglyphs. They are called rock carvings. So rock carvings were there around 10,000 BC. And what are those? These are carvings on the rocks which depicted a story. So it tells us a story. By looking at the carvings on the rocks, we could decipher a story. Okay, numerals. Then came numerals. Okay, they were also carved in different surfaces. So people started to use numerals after the pictures. Then came the characters, the real characters, and last came the alphabets. So alphabets developed through symbols. So before alphabets came, there were symbols. People used different types of symbols to convey messages. Okay, so these were regarded as the landmarks of communication process. So first came cave paintings, then came symbols, and when people became sophisticated, their society became more complicated. Their society became more structured. Uh, they began to learn new things, and they used other things to convey messages. Like they used smoke to convey message. Okay, people living in one part of the mountain may use smoke to convey a message to people living in another part of the mountain. Okay, so using the smoke, they will maneuver different messages uh, through smoke. Okay, so people learned to use smoke to send signals. Okay, so people depended on these kind of elements to communicate. So smoke signals were one form to transmit a message. So smoke was used to transmit messages. Then again, a lot of things happen in the society, and people learned a lot, and other sort of things used to be used or used to be carried out by the people to send messages. And one was carrier pigeons. Okay, so people used birds to take messages, to convey messages. So this is one of the popular methods of sending the written messages. So that means our society has advanced a lot at this time when they were using carrier pigeons to take messages. So pigeons used to carry messages from people from one part to other part. Okay, so this is regarded as world's first postal service. The world's first postal service started with pigeons, and it played a major role. These pigeons played a major role uh, in World War One and World War Two. Okay, so this was one of the easiest ways to send or to convey messages. Okay, during World War, carrier pigeons were used. Right, and after that, when society became more sophisticated, postal system started. Okay, so where did the postal system start? So if you do a research, you will find that Egyptians started the postal system, and they started using courier services to send official orders. Okay, so Egyptians started the postal system or postal service, and India, China, Rome, and Persia too had an organized postal system. Okay, so we'll be surprised to find that India, our own country, had a postal system after Egypt. Okay, so if you do research on that, if you do some research on the history of postal system, you will find that the first mailbox system. So mailboxes were introduced in the postal system, and the first mailbox system and delivery of paid envelopes was started in Paris. Okay, in Paris. Okay, way back in 1653. Okay, but society became more advanced after that, and then the printing presses started functioning. So after the printing press, you know that there was a communication revolution after the printing press started. So the first printing press was developed by the Germans in 1440, and it brought a radical change in the communication process. And in the 16th century, newspapers came into existence. So after the printing press came the newspapers. So the newspapers made its advent in the 16th century. Then again, so society became more sophisticated, and electronic gadgets were introduced. Okay, as we learned a lot. Okay, radio came first. Okay, radio. So after the print communication, after the printing press, a new form of gadget came, and it was wireless, and it was also used to transmit messages. So radio broadcasting started in 1893. Okay, so it started long back in 1893, and then again, when our society became sophisticated, another important gadget also came into being, and that was telegraph. So again, it created a revolution in long distance communication when it was introduced, telegraph. And Morse code. Okay, Morse code was developed by Samuel Morse, and it used a series of clicks, tones, and lights to transmit the message. Okay, and the first telegraph message was sent in 1844. Okay, again the society became sophisticated, and another gadget also came into being, and that was telephone. Okay, you have heard about Alexander Graham Bell and telephone. So the invention of the telephone became a major form of verbal communication, and till date, it is the most reliable form of communication. So telephone is still used, and it is one of the most reliable form of communication. After telephone came television. So again, it created a revolution. So now television, if you think about television, it has become one of our integral parts of our lives, and it is a mode of indirect communication. Okay, and then again, the society got revolutionized when internet became possible. Okay, so it happened in 1950s, And internet became possible after the emergence of computers. And computers has now become a major source of communication. Okay, this saw the technology penetrating considerably in the communication process. And in the year 1973, we could see the emergence of internet. Okay, which has now become an integral part of the society. And it's because of the internet that I'm able to take this class, and you're able to listen to me. Okay, and after the internet, again, social media became a possibility, and emails, okay, or electronic mails have now become an integral form of communication in the personal as well as professional lives. So we cannot think about a day without sending an email. Okay, we send a lot of emails. We text messages. After the email came text message. Okay, it is another mode of communication which is short and fast and uses a data network. And social media has revolutionized the communication technology. It is the latest mode of communication and has digitized the whole world. Okay, so in the advent of globalization, social media plays a very important role. Okay, so the usual use of social media platforms has brought the world closer, and even during the COVID-19 pandemic, social media has been one of the most popular modes to transmit messages when people were locked inside. So, but still, the communication is evolving. It has evolved over the ages and gone through lots of transformation. Today, it has become quite convenient and efficient to communicate. Right. So these are uh, the evolution, the important points in the evolution of communication. And now we move on to the elements of communication. Okay. Now, uh, before going into elements of communication, that is the characteristics of communication, we should know what the word communication is all about and how it originated. Okay. So communication as a word uh, has its origin from the Latin word. So it originates from a Latin word, and that Latin word is communicationis. Okay, communicationis. That is the Latin word from which communication became possible. And what is communicationis? It means to share. What is that you are sharing? You're sharing information. You're sharing knowledge. So if somebody asks you for the definition of communication, it can be said that it is an act of purposefully and actively exchanging information between two or more people to send or receive a message through a shared system of signs and symbols. Okay. So that is the definition of communication. Now, let us look at the basic elements of communication. So, if you want to define communication, there should be some basic elements you should define first. What constitutes your communication process? And for that, there should be a source. Okay, there should be a source for communication. That is, there should be a sender and there should be a receiver for the communication. Second thing, there should be a message. So between the sender and the receiver, there should be a message to be sent. So that is the second element of communication. The third element is channels. There should be different channels through which communication is passed. Number four, there should be a receiver. If there is a sender, there should be a receiver as well. Okay. Somebody should be there to receive the message. Otherwise, our message will just go in the air. Okay.
So,
And yes,
uh, so your slide is not visible. Like, are you
pardon?
sharing any PPT?
No, 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 no. I'm not sharing the PPT.
Okay, okay,
Yeah. Yeah. Just listen. That's all.
okay, sir. Thanks.
So, yeah. So, number five is there should be an environment. Okay. There should be a suitable environment for you to have the communication. If there is no suitable environment, communication will not take place. For example, you should be able to listen while a sender sends a message and the receiver has to receive it. uh, you should be able to receive that message. If something happens in between, if there is a hindrance, for example, if there is noise, okay, if there is noise in the communication process, uh, there will be a lot of strain to communicate. Your message will not reach the center. In that case, communication is not possible. Suppose you are using English language to communicate, and the receiver do not know the English language. Okay, suppose if that happens, then the communication is not possible. So the sender should know which language the receiver knows, and then start communicating in that language. Okay, and another important element for communication is the context. There should be a context. Okay, for communication. Uh, Context. I mean, there should be something to communicate. There should be a context to communicate. Suppose you are talking about films, a recent film you have watched. That is a context. Suppose you want to issue a notice to your office. That is a context. Okay. So there should be a context for the communication. And last but not least, indifference. Indifference are of different types. It could be a hindrance, and indifference could also be taken in a positive way. Suppose the sender is sending a message and the receiver is receiving it. So if receiver asks a question, if he or she does not understand the message, he could ask a question. Now, when that question is asked, that is an indifference. But it could also mean that the receiver has understood about the message, and from his understanding, he is asking that question, or he may be asking that question to clarify his doubts. So, after clarifying his doubts, he can understand the message. So, it could also be taken in a positive sense. Right. Now, let us move on to difference between general and business communication. Now, what exactly is communication? We already discussed that it is sharing of information, it is sharing of knowledge from one person to the other. And in this context, when we are talking about business communication, it relates with business related areas or topics. That is what we are doing here. We are doing a course on communication related with business activities. So, business communication is derived from general communication related to business activities. Now, what exactly is this general communication which happens in business activities? So, general communication deals with day to day or general topics which may or may not be specific in nature. Now, there are differences, okay, between the two, that is business communication and general communication. Now, if you want to see the differences between business communication and general communication, it is not the same exactly. Okay, if somebody asks you what is business communication and what is general communication, there are certain characteristics which uh, differs. Now, look at business communication. In business communication, it uses a specific format for communication. There is business jargon. There is a particular language used in the business circle, and you may use that. You may use a lot of words related with business activities. But in general communication, it uses varied formats for communication. Well, general communication has, when I say it has varied formats, it doesn't adhere to certain specific modes of communication. It could be anything. For example, it could be an informal communication between parent and a child. It could be an intimate communication between two lovers. It could be a personal communication between two friends. It is not formal in nature, right? So there are varied forms of communication in general communication, but business communication uses a specific format. They use a particular jargon, that is words which are used in business circles, and if you again study business communication, you will find that it is usually formal in nature. Okay, business communication is usually formal in nature, and but general communication is informal. Okay, general communication is always informal. And again, if you look at the differences, business communication is usually it is practical and unbiased. Okay, but general communication can be vast and can be fictitious and biased at times. Okay, another difference between business communication and general communication is, in business communication it specifically follows the norms and procedures of the organization. Now, when I talk about the organization, there may be some specific rules and regulations that is followed in an organization. In newspaper industry, uh, we may have heard about a phrase called style book. Okay, style book, book of style. No, it talks about the laws and regulations, the rules and regulations, specific rules and regulations followed in that particular institution, and that is written in a style book, and everybody has to follow that. So every newspaper has a style book, like that every industry or every institution has a style book. So it specifically follows the norms and procedures of the organization. And in general communication, there is no style book. It is informal, and different methods can be used. Okay. And another difference between the two is, in business communication, it focuses on the aim of the organization. There are certain aims in the organization, and business communication always focuses on that. But in general communication, it does not have a focus. It doesn't have an aim. Okay. And another difference between the two is, business communication is always official in nature, but general communication is personal in nature. And to be successful, business communication should require a feedback. Only after getting the feedback, we know whether our communication is successful or not. So, feedback is an important and integral part of business communication. But in general communication, feedback may not be so important. Okay, even if you did not get the feedback, it is not at all important. Okay, so these are some of the major differences between business communication and general communication. Okay, now let us look at some of the important purposes of business communication. What's the purpose of a business communication? You already know. Okay, from what we have discussed so far, you know what purpose business communication plays, uh, or the role of business communication in your institution or in your business enterprise. So it plays a key role in any business enterprise or industry, even if it is at the managerial level or even if it is the administrative activities. It involves communication. Okay, communication is everywhere. Business communication is everywhere. So in your enterprise, you may plan a lot. For that, communication is needed. You have to organize as a manager or as the head of an organization. You have to organize. For that, communication is needed. You have to recruit, okay, new persons. Uh, you have to recruit employees in your organization. For that, you need communication. You have to coordinate different tasks. For that, you need communication. You have to make decisions. Um, yeah, you have to make decisions. For that, you need communication. So, communication serves as a means to measure the success or growth of an organization. Now, while participating in communication, it involves different skills. Okay, like, to be involved in communication, you have to have different skills. Like, you have to have a collecting skill, you have to have an organizing skill, you have to have an analyzing skill. You will be able to evaluate facts. You should appreciate the difference between facts and inferences, and you should communicate effectively. So, these are some of the skills which are involved in communication. Okay, you have to develop a skill to collect facts, you have to organize information, you have to analyze information, and you have to evaluate. So these are some of the different skills you have to cultivate in communication process. Now, so communication is successful only when the purpose is fulfilled. So what is the purpose of communication? From this, you know that it is to share, it is to inform, it is to persuade, it is to motivate a desired action. So these are the important purposes of communication. It is to share, it is to inform, it is to persuade, and it is to motivate a desired action. So when you do this, in each situation which we just discussed, there is always a positive change. Okay, that is that you could see in the audience or the listener or the receiver of the communication. Now, because of these skills which I just mentioned, you will be able to uh, change the attitude or perception or belief in the target audience in a desired manner. So you could always manipulate using your communicative skills. So the ultimate analysis of all business communication is manipulative, purposive, and goal directed. So these are the important purposes of communication. And there is a case study which is given in your text. It is how an effective communicator is successful. For example, here somebody is trying to sell a shoes and to the customer, and how he becomes successful. So that is what is explained in the case study. You could go through that, okay, after this session. Okay, I'm not. You just read it. Okay, after this session, it's a case study given in your text in page number 14 and 15 also. Right. Now let us move on to another important aspect of communication, and that is use of proper language. Okay. So for the effective communication to take place, there should be proper language for a specific purpose. Okay. So I already mentioned that communication is always purposive. Okay. Like that, language is also purposive. Therefore, we have to study the relation between language and the purpose of its use. So business communication plays a major role here because it deals with language and how the language should be used in order to be successful in communication. So again, even if we use language to communicate, the purpose is the same. It is to share, it is to inform, it is to persuade, it is to create or to argue. Okay. So these are the purposes which we use language for, and we can also combine these purposes. So this is also the purpose of language, just as we have discussed the purpose of communication. It has the same purpose. Okay. So making use of good language is also an integral part of business communication. We'll deal with that later, how you can use good language, okay, to be successful in communication. Now, there is another important topic which you should have in mind, okay, for your exams as well as uh, while you start working in a business enterprise after you complete your MBA, and that is the 7 C's of communications. Very, very important. Okay, there are 7 C's of communication which you could use in conveying important messages effectively and increasing the employee engagement and productivity. Okay, so what are these 7 C's? As an MBA student, you have to have a very good understanding about these 7 C's of communication. So number one is clarity. Okay. So while you send a message to someone, okay, there is a sender as well as a receiver. You know that. While you send a message, instead of trying to send too many messages, you could send it one at a time. And while sending the message, you should use simple and precise language. Okay, it should be simple and precise. Precise means to the point. Now, now the features of clarity are this: if you want your message to be clear, there should be clear understanding between the sender and the receiver. There should be clarity of thoughts and ideas between the sender and the receiver. And you should use simple, appropriate, and precise words. Okay, so when these three happens, there is clarity in your message, and what the sender sends will be understood by the receiver. Number two, okay, we are discussing the 7 C's of communication. Number two is the correctness. Okay, the correctness of your message. While I say correctness, it involves the correct language. Okay, while you are using Malayalam, the sender is using Malayalam, the receiver should know Malayalam. If the sender is using English language or Hindi, the receiver should also know English or Hindi. So make use of the correct language, grammar, data, etc. is very important to communicate the message clearly. So that involves the correctness of the message. And in order for your message to be correct, there are three integral parts which you should keep in mind. One is it should be timely. Okay, that is, uh, it should have something in the current time. You cannot mention something. It should be relevant. Okay, it should be relevant in the time you are using that message. It should be exact and it should be correct. Number two, it can act as a confidence booster. Okay, the receiver, after receiving your message, could build up confidence because he understood what your message is. So it could be a confidence booster to the receiver. And your message is, if your message is correct, it has a greater impact on the audience. Okay, so this is what involves the correctness of the message. Normally, it involves the use of correct language, grammar, data, etc. Number three, number three C is the conciseness of the message. What is conciseness? It means communicating using minimum but appropriate words. Okay, use minimum words to convey your message. If you use a lot of words, it may be like beating around the bush. Your audience, the receiver, may not understand your message if you use a lot of words. So, conciseness, if you follow conciseness, it will be time saving. Okay, you could just send your message in a few words, and it avoids excessive use of unnecessary words like redundant words, repetition. You could avoid repetition. It is, if your message is concise, it is short and limited, and it will be there in the brain of the audience for a long time. And if it is concise, it will be appealing and comprehensible, easy to understand. And it should not repeat itself. A redundancy, a repetition of words should be avoided. So these are some of the important things you could achieve if your message is concise. Number four, the C is courtesy. Okay, courtesy. What is courtesy? This is one of the important C's of communication, which shows respect. Okay, when your message shows respect, politeness, and a judicious behavior to the other party, it may create goodwill in the audience as well as the receiver. So, if you have courtesy in your language, it shows that you are considerate towards the feelings of your audience. You are positive and focused. You are unbiased. Okay, so if you use courtesy in your language, these are the things which you could achieve while sending the message. Number five, or the fifth C is concreteness. Concreteness. What is concrete? What is a concrete message? It is specific, meaningful, and a clear message which avoids ambiguity and double meaning. Okay, some messages can be ambiguous, means it is confusing. The receiver may not understand what you are trying to say. It may create ambiguity, confusion in his mind. Okay, so if you use a concrete message, it could support facts and figures which you have mention to the audience. It will be clear and precise, and it avoids misinterpretation. So that is what concreteness of the message could achieve for you. And we move on to the sixth C, and that is consideration. What is that? You take into consideration the audience who is listening to your message. Okay, you should understand the audience, their viewpoints, their culture, their mindset, their values, etc. Suppose you are talking on the stage. Okay, you are a manager of a business enterprise, a CEO of a business enterprise, and the audience are LKG students. Okay, so you should come down to the level of the LKG students and talk to them in that fashion. You cannot just send a barrage of business acumen or jargon to these small children, small kids. So that is how you are considerate to the audience. Okay, so when you are considerate, you just forget about the you. Okay, you means you just forget about yourself. Okay, you will not be selfish. You will be empathetic. You will understand the audience and will be in their shoes. Okay, while speaking with them, and you will always be optimistic while talking with your audience. And last but not least, the last C, the seventh C is completeness. Okay, and what does this term suggest? It means that any communication, be it personal or professional, should be complete. It should not be left incomplete. That means it should deliver all the facts and information required to send the message to the receiver. Okay. Now, if your message is complete, there is no confusion, there is no incompleteness, then what will it achieve for you? It builds reputation of your organization. If your message is complete and people understood what you are trying to say, it builds the reputation of your organization. It is cost saving. Okay, you don't have to repeat that again in another speech or again in another meeting. One meeting is enough, and people understood what you are trying to convey, and you don't have to call for another meeting. Okay, and if your message is complete, it removes the barriers of vague information. There is no confusion at all, and your message helps in better decision making. So you could achieve this if your message is complete. So these are the 7 C's of communication, and as a business graduate, you should understand what these 7 C's are all about. Okay, you should have an in-depth study on this as well. Okay, it could be asked in the examination. So that is unit one, and we move on to unit two. Okay, now that is the process of communication. So what exactly happens in the process of communication? So after studying this unit, you will be able to understand the two-way communication process. Okay, what is this two-way communication process? You will understand. We will be discussing a lot of theories about this, and you will also understand the barrier to communication, the obstacles that could happen in communication. And number three, after studying this unit, you will be able to understand ways to overcome the obstacles or barriers to communication. Right. So let us move on to unit two, process of communication. Now, you know that communication, we know what is communication. We have discussed the purpose of communication. And you know that communication is one of the integral parts of any individual or an organization. Now, there are a lot of specific ways to communicate effectively. So it is important to understand the process of human communication so as to avoid common errors which take place in a communication. So we'll also be discussing about the errors which could take place in communication. Now, there are a lot of things which could hinder your communication process. Now, suppose I'll just give an example. You know that the structure of English language and the structure of, I'm talking about Malayalam, structure of Malayalam language is different. Okay, both have different structures. For example, in English structure, it is always the same. there is subject verb agreement in English structure. SVO. That is the structure of English language. Subject comes first, verb comes next, and object comes last. Okay, SVO. But in Malayalam, it has a different structure. SOV is the structure of Malayalam. Subject comes first, object comes next, and verb comes last. Okay, so there is a lot of difference between the structures. Now, while we are talking in English, I'm a Malayali. When I'm talking in English, there could be an obstacle or there could be an indifference. And that indifference is known as the mother tongue indifference. This is an obstacle in communication. So, what happens is when somebody asks me something in English, what I will do is first I will think in Malayalam, what is trying to convey, and then translate that into English. But the things which could happen in our brain is our Malayalam structure interferes with the English structure, and we may use the structure of our mother tongue while speaking in English, forgetting the structure of the English language. That could create errors while speaking in English. Okay, so that is one of the interferences. That is one of the obstacles in the way of communicating. Okay, okay. So we will be discussing about these errors. Also, in this unit, we will be discussing about different models of communication to understand the process. There are different theories. Uh, there is one-way communication. There is two-way communication. So we'll be discussing all these models. Okay. Now, let us move on to some of the different models of communication. Now, the first important model of communication is the linear concept of communication. Okay, so what exactly happens in the linear concept of communication? There are some questions given in your text. Now, look at those questions. Who says? Who is the speaker? What is said? What is spoken? Where is it said? What is the context? To whom it is said? Who is the receiver? With what effect it is said? What is the feedback? What did the receiver understand? These are the questions which we have to ask in the linear model of communication. Okay, so what exactly happens in a linear model of communication is it is transmission of information. Okay, it is conveying information from a sender to a receiver, and it is considered to be a one-way process. There is only one-way communication, one-way process of communication. There is no two-way process of communication. Sender sends the message, okay, through some channel, and it reaches the receiver. There is only one way of communication. There is no two-way communication. Okay, so the goal of this communication, linear model of communication, is to manipulate or control the receiver. That is, the receiver cannot ask anything back. He or she just has to listen and obey whatever is said by the sender. So this happens in the linear process of communication. Okay, the receiver just passively receives the message. Okay, he does not speak anything back. So it is the goal of this communication is always to manipulate or control the receiver. So it is assumed that the message reaches the receiver intact and unchanged. The message will reach the receiver without any changes. Okay, and it travels through the medium chosen by the sender. It could be any medium, newspaper, radio, television, anything. Okay, or an email. So this is the linear model of communication. Okay, so you can understand what exactly is the linear concept of communication. It's very simple. There is only one way of communication. There is no two-way communication. Now we come to the second model, and that is the Shannon-Weaver model of communication. The Shannon-Weaver model of communication. So this were introduced by two important guys. One is C. Shannon and W. Weaver. So, and it is known as the Shannon-Weaver model. So these they were actually linguists. They were among the first to point out that messages may be altered or blocked in the process of communication. Okay, so they found out that messages may be altered or blocked in the process of communication. So while communication is taking place, messages could be altered or it could be blocked. And that is known as the Shannon-Weaver model of communication. Now, their model is based on a mathematical or mechanical understanding of the communication process, with the fundamental issue being that the message received does not equal the message sent. You know what? In the linear model of communication, the message was intact. The message sent by the sender was received as such by the receiver. But here in the Shannon-Weaver model, after the message is sent by the sender, the receiver may manipulate it in a different way. Okay, it could be manipulated in a different way. There may be hindrances in between. Okay, and the message could be understood or manipulated in a different way, which it was sent by the sender. Now, any kind of obstacles could have happened on the way to manipulate the message. I once told an example about the noise, okay, being an obstacle. So maybe because of the noise, the receiver did not receive the message intact. He or she understood in a different way. So later in 1949, the Shannon model was published in a mathematical theory of communication co-authored by Weaver. So they actually used this particular model in a paper which was authored by Shannon as well as Weaver, and it came in a mathematical theory of communication. Okay, so what exactly did they do with this model of communication? Weaver pioneered the use of feedback as a noise reduction technique. Now, noise could be anything. It could not only be noise, it could be any sort of obstacle. Okay, that could happen when the message is sent. Now, Weaver, okay, that is Shannon's friend, he started using the thing called feedback, okay, to reduce this noise reduction technique. For example, sometimes the receiver did not understand. Okay, so the feedback given by the receiver to the sender may remedy this situation. For example, the sender, after getting the feedback, knows that the receiver did not understand his message. So the sender could again uh, resend the message till the receiver understands. Okay, so feedback is one of the remedial measures pioneered by Weaver. So the Shannon-Weaver model, okay, when both these friends came together, did not consider feedback to be an essential component since it saw communication as a linear process with feedback as a separate act of communication. But when these two friends came together, they may have different assumptions when they made their individual decisions, Weaver and Shannon. But when they came together in the Shannon-Weaver model, they did not consider feedback to be essential component. Okay, they saw communication as a linear process with feedback as a separate act of communication. So they said that feedback should be considered separately. Not okay, and communication is a linear process. Okay, so that is what they assumed communication to be. So there is a figure used here in your text. You should go through that to understand the Shannon-Weaver model. Okay, there is a figure in page number 23 of your text, decoding the Shannon-Weaver model. You could go through that to understand uh, more about Shannon-Weaver model. Okay, right. The concept the concept is predicated on the notion that, so what exactly is this Shannon-Weaver model? If you go deep into that, you will see that the concept of Shannon-Weaver is predicated on the notion that communication takes place only after the message has been received and that it should be received as intact as possible. So this is another important concept of Shannon-Weaver model. They say that communication can happen only after the message has been received. Okay, so before the reception of the message, communication does not happen. So this is their model. Okay, this is what they argue. Right. You may have your own suggestions, your own opinion, but this is what is said by Shannon-Weaver model. That is, communication happens only after the receiver receives the message, and it should be intact. It should be clear. Of course, this is a theoretical notion of perfect communication. In real life, filters in both the senders and receivers' minds influence the meaning of message. But in real life situation, Shannon-Weaver model may not be possible because there are a lot of filters in the minds of the sender and the receiver. Okay, what are these filters? Culture is one of the filters. Your literacy is another filter. You can understand a message based on what you have learned so far. You can understand a message based on what culture you belong to. So these are different filters in the minds of the sender and the receiver. So in real life situations, there may be filters, and we may not adhere to the Shannon-Weaver model theory. Okay, and feedback to some extent corrects any distortions and tends to complete the communication cycle. Okay, feedback can correct distortions. Okay, if there is feedback from the receiver to the sender, and the sender again repeats the message in a more precise, simple way, it could correct any distortions. Okay, that could happen only if there is feedback. Okay, right. So another important concept of Shannon-Weaver model is the source of information. Okay, the source of information. It is also called as ideation, where ideas originate. Okay, now let us look at what is this source of information. The information source is the first step in the communication process. So in the Shannon-Weaver model, the information source is the first step in the communication process, or in any communication process, the information source is the first step. Okay, what is this source of information? The sender has some unprocessed data. Okay, the sender is the source of information here, and in his brain, he or she has some unprocessed data, and his or her goal is to turn the data into a message that can be shared. So first, you turn the data in your brain into a message. Okay, you are the source. Always imagine that you are the source. You turn the data in your brain into a message which could be shared. So the information source of the communication process is the source of a message. So here your brain or you yourself is the source of the message. Now, next important thing in the process of communication in this model is encoding. Okay, encoding. What is encoding? The sender, okay, the imagine that you are the sender. Okay, the data in your brain has already been processed, and it is going to be turned into a message. The sender composes the message after giving it some thought. Okay, like you uh, imbibe some verbal symbols or any other symbolic form of expression into your message, and you make it into a message. So you're compiling, you're composing a message in your brain. This is what is termed as encoding. Okay, this procedure is known as encoding. So you have composed the message is ready to be sent. Now there should be a channel for transmitting your message. Now, what is a channel? A channel is a suitable medium for sending a message. You could send it orally or in writing. Okay, so voice is a channel, your language is a channel when you try to send it orally. If you try to send your message in writing, that is your channel. Okay, writing is your channel. If it is sent electronically, that is your channel. Okay, so you are using a signaling system, you're using a code. Okay, you're using a channel. to send you a message. So after encoding, compiling your message, there should be a channel to transmit your message. Okay, right. Now your message has been sent. It had reached the receiver. Now, what happens in the receiver's end? There is decoding. A decoding should happen at the receiver's end. What is this decoding? It involves receiving, comprehending, that is understanding, and interpreting the message. Okay, the receiver receives the message, understands it, and he interprets it in his own way, in her own way. Okay, so this is how a recipient receives the message. Okay, so decoding has happened. Now, another important process is in communication is acting. Okay, now the communication process comes to a close. So it had reached the sender, it had already reached, I mean, the receiver. Okay, and the receiver had decoded the message. Now he or she had to act. The communication process comes to a close when the receiver acts on an interpreted message, just as the sender intended. So the receiver, after receiving the message, acts on that. So the sender has been successful. What the sender intended had reached the receiver, and the receiver acts on the message. So here we could see that the communication completes a full circle, bringing the sender and receiver together as two sides of the same coin. Okay, so this is how messages are encrypted and sent. Now, let us talk about some of the hindrances or obstacles or noises that happen when the message is sent. Noise could be anything. Okay, now while the message is sent, it could be interfered with noise, it could be susceptible to noise. Now, when noise happens, noise simply doesn't mean a noise. It could be anything, any sort of obstacle while sending the message. It could obstruct or distort your message, your communication. It prevents the message from being sent from the transmitter to the receiver. So, what is noise? According to certain theorists, it could refer to any sort of disturbance in the physical environment around the act of communication. It could be poor audio quality, it could be phone dropouts, it could be bad printouts, or unreadable writing. Excuse me. So any of these could be considered as an interference, as an obstacle, as a hindrance, as a noise in the mode of communication. Now let us look at filters in the communication process. Okay. Now filters, like noise, could be anything. Okay. Now it can also be responsible for communication distortion. Communication could also be manipulated by the filters which are in the mind of the sender as well as the receiver. Okay. Now, many of the filters are psychological in nature. For example, your attitudes, your beliefs, your experiences, your self awareness, and the ability to think coherently are all filters. I also talked about your culture, your literacy. These are all filters. So, based on what you have, you can distort or understand a message. Okay. So, while the sender sends communication and the message travels, it could get distorted by the receiver's filters. Okay. Which could be his experience, which could be his knowledge, which could be his sentiment, and he or she could easily misinterpret the message. So, these are filters. Okay. Now, these are the important points of Shannon-Weaver model of communication. And so we have discussed linear model of communication, Shannon-Weaver model of communication, and another important theory is two-way communication process. Okay, two-way communication process. This is the next important theory, which happens in the communication process. Now, communication is here in this model, in this theory, communication is viewed as a two-way process. Okay, that is, the receiver also serves as the sender of feedback to the transmitter to complete the communication cycle. That is, the sender sends a message, the receiver sends it, the receiver receives it and sends back another message to the sender. So there is two-way communication. Both of them understand each other, they clarify their doubts. Okay, there is no one-way communication, there is two-way communication here. Okay, so they interact. So there is interaction, two-way interaction. Okay, so both the sender and the recipient play a very important role and reversible role. The receiver is not passive here, he's active. Okay, both the sender and the receiver are active in the two-way communication process. And this is considered to be one of the most modern approaches. Okay, because in the linear model or in the Shannon Weaver model, somewhat an autocratic approach is being done by the sender, and the receiver is somewhat passive. But here, it is a two-way process and is considered to be a modern approach. Okay, so it views communication. This theory views communication as a reciprocal process involving the exchange of messages. Okay, and another important thing is the sender, that is the source of the message, and the receiver are often the same individual. There is no clear separation between the two positions. Okay, so the sender and the receiver can be the same individual. Okay, he sends the message and he receives the message as well. So a two-way communication process could also happen in this way as well. Okay, it could happen between two persons, or it could happen within one person. Okay, uh, for example, it's a psychological process. You just send a message to your brain. Okay, you are sending your message to your brain. You receives an answer. Okay, you receives a solution. So the sender and the receiver are the same person. I'm just giving you an example. So there is no clear separation between the two positions. So two-way communication could involve two individuals or one individual at a time. One individual could also indulge in a two-way communication. Okay, he could talk to himself, he could talk within himself. Okay. Uh, so this is the important ideas on the two-way communication model. Now, let us look at some of the important barriers to communication. As a good communicator, as a business communicator, you should also know about the barriers to communication. Okay, so in any type of communication, there are barriers. Okay, by which the message could not be understood. Now, the barriers or the obstacles could be categorized. For example, there are intrapersonal barriers. We'll be discussing about that. There may be interpersonal barriers, number two, and there may be organizational barriers, number three. So these are the three important barriers which or obstacles which we have to discuss. Now, what is this intrapersonal barriers? Okay, we are talking about intrapersonal barriers. Now, every individual is unique. Okay, you are unique, and I am also unique. We have our own views, our own experiences, our own education, our culture, our own personality, and every individual is unique. Okay, so based on our thinking, we perceive, we understand the information in different ways, in various ways. See, these differences are due to inherent or intrapersonal obstacles. Now, what are these intrapersonal obstacles that we are talking about? Okay, so I told you that every individual is unique. So he or she may have different intrapersonal obstacles. What are these intrapersonal obstacles? Because every person is unique. One is wrong assumptions. Everyone has wrong assumptions. Okay. Number two is varied perceptions. You may understand something differently. I may understand something differently. Okay. That could also be a hindrance, an obstacle. You come from a different background. I also come from a different background. That could also be an obstacle. You have a wrong inference. I also have a wrong inference. That is another obstacle. You may block some categories from your mind. That is, you may not like something, so you block it. Okay. So if you hear about such things, you may not understand because you had already erased that particular memory from your mind. So you may not show any interest. Okay. For example, uh, just an example, you don't like ice creams. So if somebody is talking about ice cream, you may not show any interest in ice creams at all. I may be wrong. Okay. I'm just giving an example, right? So there are some blocked categories in your mind. So when you hear about those blocked categories, you may not show interest. It is a barrier. Categorical thinking, okay, that is another barrier. That is, your thinking may differ. Okay, you may categorize, okay, or you may not categorize when you hear something. So that could also lead to indifference. For example, you may be able to analyze something when you hear it. You may not be able to analyze something if you don't understand it. Okay, so this could also be a hindrance in your understanding a message. Now, let us look at these things differently. I talked about wrong assumptions in your mind. Okay, uh, see, many hindrances or obstacles could happen because of the wrong assumptions. Uh, for example, if somebody writes you a prescription, for a doctor writing a prescription, he instructs the patient to take the medicine only SOS. Okay, he uses those codes SOS without explaining it. That means in an emergency. SOS means in an emergency, without knowing if the patient knows the phrase SOS. So if the patient does not understand SOS, it is a barrier, it is an obstacle in the communication process. So wrong assumptions uh, could lead to disasters. Okay, even in a communication model. Another thing which we discuss is varied perceptions, understanding of the message differently. In your text, the example of the story of six blind men about an elephant is given. So these six blind men describe the elephant after touching it in many areas. Okay, so they understand the elephant as a fan, a rope, a snake, a sword, a wall, and a tree. So none of them are wrong, but as part of uh, the perception they received. But this is not right. We know that this is not right. They are touching the elephant, but they could not see it is to be an elephant. So the varied perceptions, the varied degrees of understanding may distort the message. Now, differing backgrounds. Okay. See, every person is unique. You may be from a different background. I may be from a different background. So because of the differences in education, culture, language, environment, our socioeconomic standing, backgrounds may differ, context may differ, and we may understand the message differently. So this is also a hindrance, an obstacle. Wrong inferences, I already explained. Okay, blocked categories, that is also explained, and categorical thinking has also been explained. So these are all intrapersonal barriers. Okay, you could go through that deeply in your text. Now let us move on to interpersonal barriers. Okay, what is this interpersonal barriers? Now, uh, so in a business environment, okay, we neither attempt to change our traits nor can we do it. Okay. Now, some common causes of interpersonal barriers are this. See, in your business environment, there are some common interpersonal barriers. You may be aware of this. One is your limited vocabulary. Okay, suppose if you have limited vocabulary, communication is very difficult to happen. Okay, so in order to be proficient in a particular language, you should have proficient vocabulary in that particular language. So here, if you are working in a business enterprise and you are talking in English or in your regional language, you should have sufficient vocabulary or business jargon to communicate in that particular context which you are working in. So your limited vocabulary may be a hindrance. It is an interpersonal barrier. Another is incompatibility of verbal and non-verbal messages. Some may be able to verbalize. Some may be able to convey the message verbally. Some may be able to convey the message non-verbally. So there is incompatibility between the two. You may be proficient in both. Okay. If you are proficient in one and you are not good in the other, then there is a hindrance. So this is another interpersonal barrier. Emotional outburst. Suppose you are short-tempered, okay, then communication will not happen. Okay, this is an example. This is another interpersonal barrier. Selective communication. Okay, communication selectivity. Okay, what you are trying to say. Okay, there is a selective process in the communication. So that is also an interpersonal barrier. We will discuss about that. Your cultural variations. You may belong to a different culture, and every culture has its own unique aspects. But that could also be a hindrance in understanding each other. That is another interpersonal barrier. Poor listening skills. Okay, if you are not interested, if you don't pay sufficient attention to the sender while receiving the message, then that could also be a hindrance. Okay, in your communication. And excuse me. Last but not least, noise, disturbance in the channel. Let us see one by one. Limited vocabulary. So inadequate vocabulary can be a big communication barrier. So as I already said, you should have proficient vocabulary to communicate smoothly. Okay. So occasionally when we are using English language, for example, we may be looking for the most perfect word or phrase that best expresses what we want to say. Now, if we fumble for words, we leave a poor impression on the audience. Okay. But if you have a large and broad pool of vocabulary at your command, it could help you make a good impression on your learners. I mean, listeners. Right. Now, talking about incompatibility of verbal and non-verbal messages. Now, we use a lot of verbal as well as non-verbal cues while we communicate. Okay, so non-verbal cues could also play a very important role uh, while sending the message. Now, we could ignore or we could misinterpret the non-verbal cues, and the message could be completely distorted. Okay, so what the sender sends will not be received by the receiver as such. Okay, he may not understand what was being sent by the sender. Okay, uh, now physical appearance also plays an important role in the non-verbal cue. For example, if it is an important event in your enterprise, you should dress appropriately for the event. Okay, so that is a non-verbal cue. Means you are giving sufficient importance to that program, and you are also giving respect to the audience because you had dressed appropriately for the occasion. Okay. Number two, keep your clothing tidy and clean. Okay, whatever may be the event, if you wear tidy clothing and your clothing are clean, it creates an impression. It is a non-verbal cue that you are courteous and you are showing respect. Your hair is kempt. Okay, your suitable hairstyle. Okay, you are following a suitable hairstyle. It is okay. It is not disheveled, and it shows that you are showing respect to your audience, and you are also wearing clean and polished shoes. All this gives an impression about your personality, And these are all non-verbal cues, okay, which you could follow. Now, I also talked about emotional outbursts. There are a lot of things which make a person, okay. Positive emotions are there, negative emotions are also there, okay. So when there is an emotional outburst, if there is an extreme happiness and you are laughing out loud in a formal situation, that could be a hindrance for understanding your message, okay. Or if you are short tempered and you just interpret whatever your subordinates say or whatever your colleagues say, that is also an emotional outburst, okay, which could hinder your message, okay. So emotional outbursts could also be uh, a barrier, okay. um, yeah. Now there is another thing called communication selectivity. I told you that communication selectivity is also an interpersonal barrier. What exactly is communication selectivity? Okay, it is a kind of obstacle or a barrier imposed by the recipient in a communication process when he or she pays attention to only a portion of the message. It is called selective listening. You got it? When somebody speaks to you, you listen to that particular thing which you like most, and the rest you just forget or you don't listen. This is called selective communication or selective listening. Or you also talk about things which you only like, and you just avoid certain things which you don't like. Here also you are communicating selectively, okay. So when this happens, this becomes a barrier. So this is called communication selectivity, okay. That shouldn't happen. And there is also cultural variations, okay. Based on the different culture you are in, there could be barriers, okay. You should understand the culture which your colleagues are from, and they should also understand your culture, okay. For example, uh, you may shake hands or you may do a gesture of courtesy in front of your friends. That may be appropriate in one culture but inappropriate in another culture. So you should understand those things which defines different cultures and act according to that. If you don't do that, it may become a hindrance, right? Now, another important thing which I mentioned in interpersonal communication is poor listening skills. Now, many of us like to talk. In fact, talk a lot. We don't like to listen at all. Now, listening is a talent. Okay, you should listen a lot. Now, if we have poor listening skills, we may not understand the message clearly. If we have poor listening skills, we may not understand what uh, our colleagues, our subordinates are trying to convey through their message. So, cultivating a good listening habit is another important thing. If you don't have that particular listening habit, it becomes another hindrance in the interpersonal communication. Now, last but not least, uh, the noise in the channel. Now, noise could be anything. It is not only referred to as a noise, it is not restricted to oral descriptions, but it could take the shape of visual, audiovisual, textual, bodily, psychological interruptions. Anything that hinder the understanding of message could be taken as a noise. Okay, anything. Now we have another sort of barrier, and that is organizational barriers. Okay, we have also barriers in our organization. See, communication exist, or the obstacles in communication, hindrances in communication exist not just between individuals or between two persons, but also inside organizations. Inside organizations also there are barriers. Okay, so see, every company, regardless of size, has its own communication strategies and must operate under its own communication environment. Okay, now in an organization, there are many types of communications which happen. One way of communication is vertical communication. That is It could happen in two ways: coming from above to below. That is, coming from the top level to uh, the employees level. Okay, the subordinate level. And it could also happen from the bottom to the top. Okay, from the employees to the employer. Now, this is vertical communication. Horizontal communication is also there in organizations, like communication between equals, communication between colleagues, communication between officers in the same department, in different departments. Okay, that is cross communication is also there. We will try to define it. Okay, later what these communications are. But here the thing is, there are barriers, obstacles in the organization as well. Okay, now let us look at some of the main organizational barriers. One is too many transfer stations. Okay, uh, for example, if there are a lot of links in the communication chain, okay, when the communication filters from one individual to another throughout the organization, there may be chances of communication. Okay, because the same message may not be interpreted as same by a different person. So when it reaches the last employee of the organization, it may be completely distorted. So if there are too many transfer stations, there are too many intermediaries when the message is sent, it could distort the message. That is one of the organizational barriers. Okay, so when the intermediaries are less, if the transfer stations are less in number, the communication is more intact. Okay, right. Communication is more intact. Another is fear of superiors. Okay, fear of superiors. Can you hear me? Are you still there? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Are you still there?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Okay, okay,
Yes, sir.
right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah. Fear of superiors. This is another organizational barrier, and that is when we fear
Yes, sir.
superiors. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. There is some noise. There is some noise distortion. Okay. A barrier. That's why I asked. It is raining heavily here. Right. Okay. Is it raining there in your part?
No.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I am in
No,
Rajasthan.
sir.
No,
It is raining here. Oh, okay. 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 Right. So it is raining here. Thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
yes,
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Sir.
Yeah. Suppose you fear your superiors. It hinders your subordinates from speaking openly in strictly organized organizations. Okay. So you may fear to speak with your superiors. So some employees may avoid any sort of conversations with their superiors in order to avoid speaking directly to their employer. Now, this is also a hindrance. This is also a hindrance. Okay. Now, these are organizational hindrances which we have to keep in mind. It could happen anywhere. It could happen anywhere. Now, another is the negative tendencies. Now, many organizations create work groups. While some groups are formed according to the requirements of the task on hand, such as completing a particular work project, other small groups are also formed for recreational, social, or community purposes. Uh, I'll just come back. I have a phone call. I'll just come back. Hello, sorry for the interruption. Are you still there?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
thank you. Thank you. Right. So we are talking about negative tendencies in the organization. Okay. See, there may be different groups in an organization. Some groups are formed officially, some groups are formed unofficially. Uh, we shouldn't have any groups, but for organizational purposes, many enterprises support formation of different groups in an organization. It could be formal or informal, and these groups may consist of people with similar values, beliefs, behavior, attitudes, and opinions. Okay, uh, so see, there may be competition between these groups. There may be see sometimes there could arise suspicion between groups. It could happen. It could happen. So these are some of the negative tendencies which could happen. Okay. Now, use of inappropriate media is another important aspect of communication. Okay. Inappropriate media. For example, we can choose the medium based on our choice. Now, we can use phones, we can use emails, we can use computer presentations, teleconferencing, video conferencing, etc., etc. Now, while using these medium, we should be able to consider the time, the type of message, the course, the intended audience, etc., while transferring information. Uh, so, use of inappropriate media could distort your message. For example, uh, suppose many of us don't have access towards, uh, I mean, video conferencing. Now, if we follow a video conferencing for a meeting, and many of us don't have that facility, then that is inappropriate. So this could happen in an organization. So use of appropriate media is very important, and use of inappropriate media can be disastrous. Another important thing in a barrier in organization is information overload. Okay, now this is an age of information. This is an age of globalization. A lot of information is available at our hands. So information overload can cause fatigue, disinterested, and boredom. Okay, so which could also distort the message. It could happen sometimes. Okay, so moderate use of information sources is also recommended. So these are some of the important barriers in communication, and we have completed this unit as well. Now I will stop it here. So see you in the next class because it is heavy rains here. My message is getting distorted. Okay, so we'll